Well, welcome back to the second half of this year's Adblocker Developer Summit. If you are involved with web technologies, you may have heard about the CSS has selector slash pseudo class. And today at the summit, we have a 4-person panel that's going to bring us up to date on the most recent developments surrounding it. We're fortunate enough to have Brian Kardell and Byungwoo, both of Igalia, which has done a lot of work in this area. And we'll also hear the perspectives of Shwetank Dixit and Andrea Giammarchi, 2 of my colleagues here at eyeo. We'll be getting each of their thoughts individually, starting with Brian Kardell, who is a developer advocate at Igalia.
Hi, it's really nice to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you all about has. It's one of my favorite subjects. My name is Brian Kardell. I'm a developer advocate at Igalia. I'm also a member of the CSS working group. And let's hop in the Wayback Machine and imagine a timeline from the very first recommendation of CSS until the present day. We'll begin with the beginning of CSS. First recommendation is about 1997. It wasn't very good. It wasn't complete. There weren't really good implementations, but we got to CSS level 2 really, really early. You can see on this timeline how quickly. And that laid down all of the foundational things. And the way that we do this is with a selector that is attached to a rule. It's part of a rule. And the subject is the thing that the rule applies to. And in CSS, the subject is always the last thing. So you can style a code that's inside of a section or an example that's inside of a side note. But very, very quickly, people always ask the question, but how do I style this thing, the thing over on the left? I want to style a section if it contains code, or a side note if it contains an example. And the really, really frustrating thing is you cannot. It seems so obvious, right? I mean, the separation of concerns, which CSS is supposed to be about, really requires you to have the ability to have powerful selectors. So how could the CSS working group miss this seemingly obvious thing? And the thing is, they didn't. It has been around for kind of forever. It was in the selectors level 3 draft in August 1999. And their answer at the time looked like this. You would just mark the subject with the subject pseudo class. Over the years, there's been lots of little churns and ideas on this. One was maybe we should use a character instead of a whole pseudo class. It's more terse. But for most of the history of this feature, it has looked like this. The has pseudo class that will allow you to style a section if it has an image hero inside it, for example. Now, it is probably surprising to some people to see CSS 3 in 1999. That doesn't sound right. If you're kind of cocking your head a little bit in confusion, that's because most of us associate CSS 3 with the HTML5 era, which if you look at our timeline, this is really far along. So what happened to that big missing chunk of time? Well, what happened is what I call the lost years in the W3C. Once the W3C was established, we kind of collectively decided that this web was kind of a good first pancake, but it's not actually very good. Wouldn't it be good to have a better web, one that could have good answers for applications with first class things in it? The W3C kind of decided that HTML is gross, is definitely not for apps, and we're going to invent something else. And so for a while, everything was a mess. There were 2 competing style sheet languages, 2 competing models, 2 competing selector languages. And we're so sure that the browser that had 90% plus share of the market share actually disbanded the browser team. We also kind of weren't very good at it. We were still really learning a lot of things. We didn't have shared test suites. We weren't very good at writing the specs so that they could be implemented interoperably. They weren't very rigorous. But in the meantime, while all that was playing out, developers did this thing that we do. We built the stuff that they said that this web wasn't for with the tools that we had. I love this picture. It's in almost all of my talks because I think it's a good metaphor. When houses were originally wired for electricity, there were no outlets because there was nothing to plug in. Houses were wired for the purpose of artificial lighting. But once people had that tool, they went off and invented an entire industry. And that's kind of what we did. W3C noticed this, and it caused some, debate. And some people thought we should rev HTML, and there was a workshop, and it came to a vote, and the vote was largely no, we don't. That's where we get the what working group and the beginning of work on HTML5. And that happens right about out here. And this is where some people start to talk about HTML5 and CSS3. And it's right about this time when all of these great things are happening out in author space, like the web developer space. And we're at this, paradox time that jQuery comes along. What's really interesting about jQuery in the history of Has is that in 2007, it supported Has. The reason that it supported Has is because it was in specifications, and you need this power. So John Resig went ahead and put it in there. jQuery, as you might know, became and still is fantabulously successful as a library, is very, very widely used. And there was a thought that we could use this to put back into the standards. This is actually a really good way to pay cowpaths, maybe. So that began the jQuery standards team, which was originally Yehuda Katz and Paul Irish, then Adi Osmani, and later me. And the idea here was to create ways to plug that stuff back into standards. And this is where we got query selector all, matches closest. jQuery also has a has method. We don't have that in standards yet, but maybe. What's really interesting here is that there's a lot of subtleties, and this was actually a lot harder than you might think. Because sometimes the cowpath that we paved, not being a part of standards, and CSS will inevitably sort of disagree. So here are some examples of where that's the case. The way that these things work in jQuery and the way that they work in CSS are not actually the same. The top one will give you back a list of many things, but in jQuery that would give you back just one. And then what about this? jQuery allowed you to begin a selector with a combinator because you could provide a context element. In CSS, we tried to say that selectors should mean the same thing all the time, but there's no way in CSS to write a selector that begins with a combinator. So that is really, really hard. This is part of what we have, and it's maybe related, but it's maybe not, because the thing inside of the pseudo class doesn't have to be writable necessarily outside the selector. But this is a thing that is, shapes some of the conversations. Inevitably, in standards, there are a lot of compromises to finally reach a standard. And one of the things that came up in all of these discussions that seemed like a good compromise at the time was this idea of scope, which is a pseudo class that would allow us to write lots of the things that you couldn't write by just giving it some phony idea of a scope. And in CSS, that would just mean the document. So that seemed good. That's all I'll say about this, because it will come back later on in another portion of this talk. But whatever happened to Has, right? 2011, where we just left off in the timeline, to now is still a really long time. Why do we not have it? It was in selectors level 3 until suddenly it wasn't. Then it was in selectors level 4 until suddenly it wasn't. And there was even recently, not so long ago, discussion about whether we should move it to selectors level 5. The use cases for Has come up a lot. Frequently, it's brought up because people want just one part of the power. So why doesn't it get done? I mean, if jQuery could do it in 2007, what is the holdup? It is very, very, very frustrating to so many developers. Why can you not do this? The answer is it's complicated. In JavaScript, we're asking to evaluate one selector at a very set point in time on a particular context. And this is not that hard. That's why you can implement it in jQuery or wherever. And also there are other things like prints.xml that process the document sort of one time. And it actually has a lot more in common with the way JavaScript works. that also supports has. But in a browser, rule matching and application are live, even as the document is being built, and it all needs to work at 60 frames per second. Computationally, this is very, very complex, even with the CSS selector power we have today. And over the years, we're really only even able to do it with the powers we have today because we've figured out how to do it very efficiently. And almost all of those very efficient, smart things that we do are based on this invariant directionality of the rule, where the subject is the last thing. And has kind of breaks that. So we have to find a way around that. One seemingly obvious solution to this is to let it work in JavaScript, but not elsewhere. Because it also works in print, where you have this idea of static processing, there was an idea that maybe we could define a static profile. But most of the working group is against this because we would like to avoid fragmenting CSS. But can we? This is a circular discussion, actually. This is like the old Abbott and Costello routine, who's on first. It just goes around and round in circles. And this is very, very, very frustrating. How do we get out of this loop? And why are we in it in the first place? And I realize that this is very frustrating. So let me explain that there are some fairly mundane reasons for this. One is that spec development is kind of like other software in a lot of ways. It's really, really hard to estimate. You have to ship a product, right? So when we begin a spec, it has lots of features in it. And you have to prioritize the work. And then at some point, you might have to drop something or postpone it. And usually, very often, it's the really big and complex ones. And this winds up being exacerbated because it's not much of a choice when the complexity of has means we don't even know how to estimate it. It requires R&D of some of your best people for a potentially long period of time just to know how to size up the question. And on a normal product, you might find a way to catch up, but standards are kind of like this. There's conveyor belt of more and more and more and more and more. So getting to those big, long, hard problems on the conveyor belt is really, really hard. So this is tragic because if it doesn't get implemented priority from 3 vendors, it just doesn't move forward. And there is historically no way to get them to do anything with it. So that sucks. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's kind of the good news. At Igalia, we talk about this all the time. We have a podcast that's here. But at Igalia, we love open and we love hard problems. We've helped to do a lot of great things like CSS Grid and JavaScript classes were funded by Bloomberg Tech. We've helped advance MathML while it's been stuck for a really long time through funding various sources, including Igalia's own investment. We've worked on hardware accelerated SVG and Canvas in Workers, and that's paid for by cable boxes and cooking machines. That's really interesting. We can bring more priorities to the table. We can bring more points of view. But what's really important in this is that anytime we do that, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so we're really grateful to have this partnership with eyeo, who approached us and said, has this separation of concerns is like paramount for like ad blockers and plugins because they literally cannot control the source. There's no workarounds, really. So let's figure this out and see if we can move out of this loop. So that's what we've been doing this year. We've been giving a hard problem the priority that it deserves to get out of this loop. That's involved a lot of discussions internally and exploration, some early prototyping in Chromium. We wrote a lot of tests to figure out performance and all kinds of things. We did a lot of tweaking as we got data for those that was maybe a little concerning. We created an explainer with all of this. That's led to more discussions and finally some intents in Chromium. And since then, actually, some more discussions. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague who is going to talk about the implementation challenges and the progress that we've made on this so far. Thanks.
Well, like Brian just mentioned, next up is Byungwoo Lee, who is a developer at Igalia.
I'm going to share about the HAS prototyping progress. I'm Byungwoo Lee, a software engineer at Igalia. I will start this presentation from the has functionality that everyone may already know, and I will simply explain the problems of has and possible approaches for those. And after that, I will share the prototyping progress. It includes what have done so far and what are the remainings and what are the roughly expected schedules. The has functionality can be described using the 4 directions that exist in the relationship between 2 elements of a tree structure. So an element can be a parent or an ancestor of another element, and an element can be a previous sibling of another element, and it can be a child or descendant of another element, and also it can be a next sibling of another element. So these are the 4 directions, and by combining these directions, we can describe all the relationships between elements in a tree structure. And as you already know, CSS combinators provides only 2 of the 4 directions. So it provides a child or descendant relationship like this, and it provides a next sibling relationship like this. But it doesn't provide the other 2 directions. The main reason of the limitation is that it is efficient for performance optimization. Checking the descendant relationship is more efficient than checking the ancestor relationship because an element only have one parent, but it can have multiple children. And by removing one of the 2 opposite directions, we can place the subject of a selector to its right. From this, we can get some advantages of having simpler design and logic for selector-related operations. Each browser engine has its own designs and optimizations for the performance-critical operations like selector matching or style invalidation, and those are based on this limitation. In this context, has-pseudo class tries to provide the other 2 directions. So it tries to provide a parent or ancestor relationship like this, and it also provides a previous sibling relationship like this. When we have a condition of a reference element, we have been able to use the downward, only the downward of the reference element with the CSS combinators. But with has, theoretically, we can use all the elements around the reference element. So with has, we can match with all relationships like this, and we can select all relationships like this. And also we can style all the relationships like this. But to use has, we need to solve many problems. And as I already told, has selector matching is basically heavy operation because it needs to check the descendant of a subject element instead of its ancestors. So as you can see here, matching this selector that checks an ancestor relationship of this subject element needs more matching operations than matching this selector that checks the descendant relationship of this subject element. So in this case, has matching is ON operation where n is the number of the descendant element of this subject element. And in some case, has matching performance becomes worse. If there are multiple subject elements that share same downward subtree, there can be duplicated has argument matching operations on the downward subtree. Because of this repetitive argument matching overhead, in worst case, it can be O(n) square operation. And we also have many problems in hash style invalidation. When we have any mutation on a DOM tree, the browser engine tries to find elements that can be affected by the change and invalidate the style of those elements. So far, due to the limitations on the combinators, the element to be invalidated are always the changed element itself or in its downward subtree. Based on this limitation, the engine has long been designed and highly optimized the style invalidation steps. And has also breaks this limitation. When we have a style rule that using has and when we have any mutation that affect the has state, then we need to find the possibly affected element from the upward of the changed element instead of its downward. Due to this difference, the has invalidation cannot simply integrate it with the existing invalidation designs and optimizations. And we can easily make complex invalidation case. So as you can see here, when we use is in has and when we have any mutation that affect the is state, we need to traverse downward first to find the element that possibly affected by the is condition, and then we need to traverse upward again to find the element to be invalidated. The worst thing here is that each browser engine has its own designs and optimizations for the invalidation process. So it is difficult to get a single general solution for all browser engines. Okay, so there are so many problems in has, and it is too difficult to consider those all at once. And there might be many more unknown problems. So we decided to break the large and complex problems down into smaller problems and try to get feasible solutions for each problems and find a way of combining or extending the solutions. So instead of finding a general solution for all browser engines from the beginning, we focused to the Chromium engine to clarify some other problems and solutions for those, hoping that it will help finding general solutions or ideas for those. And we separated problems into two categories per CSS profiles. So the problems related with has selector matching were categorized problems in snapshot profile. And the problems related with the has style invalidation were categorized the problems in live profile. And we tried to find possible solutions for each problems independently. So like this, we had investigated the problems and solutions and tested functionalities and performance of those solutions and wrote some document to share about those. And based on this, we started the prototyping in the Chromium project. So you can find the related information from these links. For about the has in snapshot profile, we have landed some patches so far. So in the snapshot profile, the has supports almost all cases except some shadow boundary crossing cases. So you can try most has cases with JavaScript APIs like query selector all, matches, and closest. For the O and square problem, we were able to remove the repetitive argument matching overhead by caching has matching status within a lifecycle. But still, we need more investigation for these problems. For about the ON argument matching overhead, we may think about an approach of changing cache lifetime later. And we also proposed a change of relative selector spec, so you can get some details in this link. Since the Chromium version 95, the has in snapshot profile is under the experimental runtime flag that names enable experimental web platform features. So by enabling this flag, you can try has with JavaScript APIs, and you can also enable this by passing a command line flag like this. And currently, we are doing the prototyping of hash style invalidation. These are related with very complex and performance critical steps. And there are many kinds of variations. So first, we checked some complexity or performance impact of some variations like this. And after that, we tried to clarify the possible limitations that it can take to balance the coverage and complexity, or coverage and performance impact. And we also try to define the steps to check those limitations. So you can get the details in these links. And based on this, we are trying to start the initial implementation of hash invalidation. Actually, since the Chromium version 95, you can try hash in live profile also by passing the command line flag CSS sudo hash like this. With this flag, you can style an element with hash. But this version doesn't support style invalidation for the style rules with hash. So you can see that hash is working only on loading time. And what currently we are doing is about the hash style invalidation. So when we have any progress on this, we can see that the parent style is changed according to its descendant condition. We have roughly scheduled plans like this. So we are planning to support hash invalidation with the maximum limitation, hopefully at the end of this year. This initial step will only support hash at a terminal and top level compound selector, and it will only provide hash child and hash descendant functionality, and it will only allow one compound selector as its argument, and there will be only attribute and elemental selectors in the argument compound selector. After we finish this, we are going to try following one by one, and those are flexible for now. Okay, this is all about the hash prototyping progress so far. Thank you for listening.
Continuing the discussion next is Shwetank Dixit, who is VP of Core Technology here at eyeo.
Hi, I'm Shwetank. I'm VP of Core Tech at eyeo. As you might know, that I'm also one of the moderators for this event. But in this talk, I'm also one of the speakers. And you've heard from Brian and Byungwoo on the has story, the background, a little bit more on the implementation part. I'm here to talk a little bit about why it's relevant to ad filtering, right? So let's go. Why is this interesting to the ad filtering use case? Ad filtering requires going into the page and selecting things out properly to actually filter out, right? And having powerful selectors is really, really beneficial when it comes to this. Having powerful and flexible selectors that you can use in multiple use cases is really important for the ad filtering use case. And that's why has is important. It's quite interesting because it's quite powerful and flexible. Unfortunately, till now, it's not implemented in browsers. And because of which we do have some workarounds in JavaScript that we use in our extensions, but it's not ideal. It would be really great if this is provided natively by the browser as part of CSS. And this is the basis of our interest over here. Now, when we posed this problem to Igalia, we were talking to them about various things that would be beneficial to the web, especially when it comes to ad filtering. We talked about this as well. It was quite intriguing to both of us. They mentioned that it's been discussed in the past by various people. And the consensus all the time in the past was that there's some performance concerns, and because of which, it never really, took off. We said maybe things have changed now, since the last time this was discussed, and seriously someone took a look. Since the last time that happened, devices have increased in performance. Browser performance has also improved. Maybe there's also a fresh new way in which you can take a look at actually implementing this, which could actually address some of these performance concerns as well. And this is what Igalia took a look at and developed a very promising approach. So we're really, really excited about this. Now, to go a little bit more deeper into some of the technical areas of how this would affect ad filtering, I'll pass this on to Andrea.
As Shwetank just mentioned, to round out the conversation, we now have Andrea Giammarchi, who is a developer at eyeo.
Hello, thank you, Paul. Let me share my screen first, and hopefully everything is fine. So we have seen so far the story or the journey from Igalia, the implementers, all the challenges and everything. And Shwetank already mentioned what exactly is that has is solving for us in terms of filtering and ad blocking. And so for me, that I've always advocated somehow web standards, it has been an incredible journey because I was close to the whole process that has been described. So all the prioritizing, all the creating some sort of demos or examples, testing, all this kind of stuff. And I've done probably nothing compared to what Igalia has done, but he's been cool regardless. And like every love story, because I love also the feature itself, it starts with once upon a time. And that's something that has been mentioned already. It was jQuery. It was 14 years ago. So that's why most developers maybe...
Andrea, just very quickly, it looks like your screen has gone black. If you could just reshare it for us very quickly so we can see what you're looking at too.
That's very unfortunate. I hope this is fine now. Can you see now?
Looks great. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry about that. Anyway, it was just the second slide. So the first one was about the journey and the story. Is the fact that for me has been a love story, and the fact that it's been 14 years that I've been waiting for this to happen. And we already mentioned that jQuery was literally an inspiration for a lot of modern standards, and that's been great. But we also need to understand how powerful can be this has. selector. In this case, Brian already mentioned the section with the container, but in this case, maybe it's not a hero, maybe it's a card. And the most exciting part for me is the fact that now we can also have transitions within the same container accordingly to whatever they contain. So it's a new way of styling the outer component with the inner components knowledge that has never been seen before, except through JavaScript hackery around. And so this feature is so cool that when I see this page, every time I go there, I see red crosses all over, a lot of boxes with no, no, no. And I try to click, expand the boxes, and it shows a bigger no with an issue that if you click the issue, it goes to the issue where a lot of people are discussing, and the result is still a lot of no. So this is infuriating because you would expect after 14 years, maybe something happened. But yes, it's been complicated. Let's talk about why it's so interesting. Shwetank has been very, let's say, mild in saying some JavaScript around. But the thing is that most ads are sneakily part of what looks like exactly the same content, so are not super easy to recognize. And because they use the same container, they're all inside the same container. An ad is not just an image, it's not just a video, it's not just the text, it's the whole thing that looks exactly like everything else. So you barely notice when you see ads. And the fact that we cannot stop the selector within these containers means that we need to use mutation observer, we need to use caching validation. And if you listen to the little nightmare that Igalia went through to find all the possible solutions, well, basically, if they can do that with the native performance, imagine we are doing that through JavaScript, and that's not ideal at all. So this is great for us because we can have better performance for our users, but it's also great for the web in general. And if there is one thing I've always said is that whenever there is a native API or a native solution, especially when it's CSS, that can fix the problem or can address the problem and solve it, just go native. Never try to reinvent the wheel with JavaScript because it makes no sense. It's just more code. It makes surely the experience slightly, either slightly or very slower. And also it's great for web developers because themable containers are something new. Hopefully we're not expecting new frameworks out of this selector, but every existing framework can actually benefit from this new opportunity that wasn't possible before just through the CSS. So we have lost code, lighter pages. Also the layout, the HTML layout can be slightly simplified because we don't need a composition of multiple classes in the outer component and the inner component to understand how everything should look. So it should simplify in general. And so this is great. And like Shwetank already mentioned, and it's great because it's the right time. It's been super complex to understand all the things. It's super complex to solve as an issue. We don't know yet how far the final implementation will work as expected, but so far the progress is great. Browsers are way more powerful these days. Even feature phones can have a quite powerful and a smooth experience online. So the hardware is there, and this new approach, all this experimentation that Igalia did, it looked super, super promising. It's not just me being excited about this. I think it's pretty much everyone in the field. So as soon as few flags, like has been shown, the flag to launch the browser with the experimental version, a few articles came up, and people in the field were super, super excited and super happy. The only side effect of being excited about a technology that is not there, even if it has been around virtually for 14 years, thanks to jQuery, is that sometimes you need to be careful with the implementation. For instance, in our case, we had a conversation with our fellow blockers because maybe we decide to use a specialized prefix for features, for element hiding features that we are not confident will be exactly like the standard meant. But maybe other products, they decide to just be more user-friendly and just propose what everyone expects from has selector to do. And so the good thing is that we discussed the current work in progress. We discussed all the limitations that we know so far and all the things that we might be careful about. And the great thing is that we had this conversation, is that we are converging toward a unified syntax for the has selector that works let's say universally for all ad blockers. So we don't need to duplicate filters because we use some prefix, somebody doesn't, somebody has to convert our prefix and vice versa. So we don't want to create this kind of issue for friction for filters authors. So that's why basically everyone wins. And indeed, we are already aligned across products. At least we know that it's coming natively. We can use it, and we don't need to do too much JavaScript hackery around, especially for, at least for now, for more simple selectors. But there are already few selectors used here and there in the filters, in the ad blocking filters industry. So that's awesome, and I hope everyone else is excited as I am. And thanks again for listening to this talk. And I think we have time for some question now.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, and to everybody else who just spoke on the panel. We have had a few questions come in across our channels, and we should have time for a couple of them. This has obviously been on people's radar for quite some time. During Andrea's talk, he shared some social media feedback that he saw. I'm wondering if you guys can share any other anecdotes, any stories about the excitement that these new developments have generated amongst developers.
Well, I can tell you that even many members of the CSS working group were pretty excited to see some of this because, so for example, in 1999, that first draft that I showed with the subject selector, that was Danielle Glasman introduced that. And he has been waiting for this for a really long time. When he saw that article, he was very excited about it, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember, Brian, when you tweeted this for the first time and it sort of blew up. And I just tried to take a look at the quote tweets of people, try to see what the feedback is over there. And there was literally no one that I could see who had any sort of non-excited take on it. Everyone was sort of really, really excited about the fact that we are even considering the fact that, okay, we can have has now in browsers. The thought of it is quite exciting. So that's a small anecdote that I wanted to share. Just taking a look at Brian's tweet back in the day, like a couple of months ago, and just seeing what people are quoting on top of this, and everyone was just super excited.
Yeah, if I can add anything, a few weeks ago or months, I would say, I tried to convince everyone that XPath 2 or more should land in the browser. And one of the main reasons was because the self or ancestor selector was super powerful for what I was trying to do, but I didn't want to force everyone to use this XPath selector instead of just CSS, because with CSS is much easier, nicer, and simpler to reason about. And so for me, this was the another background story was about, I really wanted this kind of selector, and it's awesome that the community was so positive about this.
Great. We have another question that's come in. It's a bit of a broader question, but somebody's wondering what kind of impact could has have on web design moving forward?
I think Andrea covered some good examples, but one I think is what I said, just that CSS promises a separation of concerns. Like the whole model is based on being able to apply your styles without going and mucking with your markup. And the truth is that you can't really do that for a lot of things because you don't have the powers that you need. And has is
one of the core powers that you need. So I think that will have a really, really big impact.
Yeah, regarding like things like design systems, I do think it's going to have some impact. I'm sort of like curious and sort of I actually don't know how much of an impact it is going to have, but it's going to be certainly interesting to see how it impacts design systems in general for people working on those things.
Yeah, let's get to a couple that we've actually just had come into the chat right now. First one from Elisa again. What can people do right now to see HAS in action right now? I think Byungwoo shared some links earlier during his presentation. Is there anywhere else that we could see it in action?
Yes, so since the Chrome version 95, you can use HAS by enabling the experimental flag. So you can call the selector with HAS. So you can use the JavaScript APIs like query selector or query selector, like that. And after enabling the HAS in live profile, you can see that the HAS is working in the styler. So you can test that, but as I already shared, HAS invalidation is not supported yet, and I'm currently trying to do that. So when we have any progress, you can see that the style with HAS can be changed by some mutations. So you can test it with that.
Great. We've got one more question that's coming from Andrei Meshkov. The question is, are there any plans to add any other pseudo classes available in content blockers right now? For example, the contains pseudo class.
Maybe I can comment that. We haven't discussed it yet in details, one pseudo class per time, I would say. But I think what we do with contains is more addressing the text, and so far CSS cannot really address the text. So it can address attributes, it can address tags, it can address siblings, but not specifically address the text. And so that's something that we need to figure out how is that possible, or how that could even work. If it was for me, I would just propose, hey, let's put regular expression in CSS, but I think it's going to be a nightmare in terms of performance, and so we need to be careful with whatever proposal in the future there will be. But contains is surely on our radar as well.
Great. Well, Brian, Byungwoo, Shwetank, Andrea, thanks so much for participating in this discussion and for making some time for us today. It's been really fascinating for all of us. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.